Thank you, Presiding Officer. And first of all, thanks to James Kelly for creating the opportunity for having this debate. And I think it's appropriate, too, that I recognise the achievements of Jack McConnell. In two fronts, I think he will be remembered over the very long term. First of all, for the anti-smoking legislation, which I'm personally, as an asthmatic, very grateful for, but fundamentally for creating the formal links that we have with Malawi. I think it's correct that Tavish Scott talked about that being something for the long run, which will endure the vicissitudes that inevitably accompany political elections. I'm delighted that when I was Minister, I played a small part, as many others have done, in developing the relationship with Malawi. The motion that James Kelly has brought to us today is well crafted and pretty much comprehensive. It contains a number of important points that I personally would want to address. Fundamentally, being part of the anti-slavery movement, I think, is important. His contribution to bringing modern medicine to Africa is important, and his focus on education and trade. These were all key parts of David Livingstone's life in Africa. And, of course, his life in Scotland illustrates that he very genuinely was a man of the people. He was not a privileged person. He moved from worker to professional. He, in gaining his qualifications, had a much harder road to travel than those of us who in the modern era went to university, largely funded by the state, certainly not with competing interests, not having to have a day job while we undertook serious intellectual study, as David Livingstone had to do. He must have been a very fine intellect indeed, as well as a hard worker. And of course he benefited from the very broad base that the Scottish education system has. There is a monument to David Livingstone in Malawi, and it has under his name, it says, "For Christianity, Commerce and Civilization." Now, I think in some ways that may miss the point, because, of course, in Victorian times, we probably failed to adequately recognise that actually civilisation existed before the white man came along. It just was a very different civilisation, and one from which we should continue to learn in the modern era. He saw commerce as a key part of displacing the slave trade. Get a new commerce. That would be the way to get the slave trade under control. And, of course, his efforts were recognised when he was appointed the UK consul for East Africa. I did think that James Kelly might be wanting to pair up with Blantyre MPs, so I did have a look and see who some of them were. I found Felix in Jawala. I found Geoffrey in Telemaka. I have to say, quite interestingly, one of these has just crossed the floor, and the rules of the Parliament there mean you're automatically ejected from the Parliament. You've got to stay with the party you're elected with. Probably not something we'd copy, but interesting for all that. But Blantyre, of course, in Malawi, is a memorial to David Livingstone. 750,000 people, with the Stock Exchange, the College of Medicine, Broadcasting, the Supreme Court. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, by putting Livingstone in an international context. When Henry Morton Stanley said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," he of course was representing the New York Times. This is no parochial interest. He was an internationalist and attracted international attention. Presiding Officer.